A ruthless kick, a painful groan in a fierce punch in the middle of a supermarket. It all stemmed from a simmering conflict as a racist police officer confronted an elderly black man and his loyal dog. What really happened behind that explosive moment? Hit the subscribe button now to join us in uncovering shocking and unexpected stories you won't want to miss. Arthur stepped into Sarah's diner where he and his loyal dog Max had become regulars, though the old man and his steadfast companion always maintained a calm demeanor. The hostility of Mike Harris, a local police officer, loomed like a dark cloud over their mornings. Mike's cold gaze pierced straight through Arthur while his deliberate sarcastic remarks echoed incessantly. Though Arthur chose not to respond, he could feel the weight of the tension in the air. For him, Sarah's diner was more than just a place to enjoy breakfast. It was a comforting routine in his daily life, yet Mike's presence hung over it like a threatening shadow, threatening to obscure the tranquility of his peaceful mornings. Mike Harris sat in the diner's corner, his cold eyes fixed on Arthur and his dog Max, a faint scar on his wrist, a reminder of a past dog attack, fueled Mike's irrational disdain for all dogs. Max, obedient yet committed, only seemed to deepen Mike's irritation. Funny how some people think they can turn this place into a zoo and nobody will say anything, Mike said loudly enough for Arthur to hear, his tone laced with mockery. His co-workers at the table nodded and forced agreement, stifling uncomfortable smiles. They didn't dare openly show support for Mike's biting remarks. Arthur, as always, remained calm, silently stroking Max's soft fur with his thin, weathered hand. Sometimes people need to know where they belong, Mike continued, his voice lower but dripping with insinuation. He didn't call names or point fingers, but everyone in the diner knew who his words were targeting. Mike didn't stop at harsh words. His eyes met Sarah's, the diner owner, with a mixture of challenge and veiled threat. Sarah, a middle-aged woman with neatly tied hair and usually warm eyes, exhaled softly. She knew Mike's hostility wasn't just about disliking a dog in the diner. It was deeper, crueler, a personal animosity that was hard to soothe. He's ruining my appetite, Mike muttered to his colleagues, his voice low but loud enough to carry across to Arthur's table. Arthur stayed silent, but beneath his composed exterior a quiet rage brewed like an undercurrent. Max, sensing his owner's tension, looked up at Mike, his eyes watchful and protective. Mike, however, wasn't intimidated. If anything, the dog's gaze only aggravated him further. The air in Sarah's diner grew heavy with unease, affecting not just Arthur but everyone around. Mike's presence acted like a dark cloud, overshadowing the once welcoming atmosphere. For Arthur, his silence was not submission, it was the calm of a man who had faced much fiercer storms and still had the strength to endure. Behind the counter, Sarah prepared coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she heard Mike's heavy footsteps approach. His sharp gaze swept across the diner before settling on her weary face. Mike didn't need many words to make his intentions clear. The way he leaned on the counter, his posture exuding quiet menace, was enough to freeze the air around her. Sarah, Mike began, his voice low but carrying an undercurrent of threat, your diner's been doing well, lots of customers, good reputation. It'd be a shame if something happened. Sarah looked up, struggling to keep her composure. What do you mean, Mike? Mike smirked faintly, devoid of humor. I mean, maybe some health code violations come to light, or complaints about parking issues. Little things, but you know, little things can cause big problems. He shrugged as if sharing a universal truth. Sarah Understood this wasn't a suggestion, it was an ultimatum. Mike didn't have to spell it out for her to know who his true target was. Arthur and Max haven't bothered anyone, she said, her voice shaky, but determined to defend them. Everyone here likes them. Mike leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. Not everyone, and certainly not the people who make important decisions. Let me just say this, Sarah, you might want to reconsider letting certain elements stick around. He turned and left, leaving Sarah standing frozen behind the counter, still holding the coffee pot. Fear churned in her gut. She didn't dislike Arthur or Max as she admired the old man's quiet resilience in the face of Mike's relentless hostility, but the thought of inspectors showing up repeatedly, or the subtle sabotage Mike hinted at, terrified her. The next day, when Arthur arrived at the diner with Max, he was greeted by a sign in the window: no dogs allowed, no exceptions. The bold black letters on the white background hit Arthur like a blow to his pride. Max, unaware of the signs meaning, wagged his tail gently, ready to enter, but Arthur stood still, his gaze fixed on the words. His shoulders slumping slightly inside. Sarah stayed behind the counter, avoiding Arthur's eyes as he glanced through the window. She knew he understood. She could feel his disappointment, not anger, but a deep sadness that weighed heavily on her conscience. Arthur knelt, patting Max gently. It's okay, Max, we'll find somewhere else today, he said softly, his voice tinged with loss. Max, as if sensing his owner's emotions, nuzzled Arthur's hands, silent and still, from his corner of the diner. Mike sipped his coffee and smirked. This was his victory, small but significant. Watching Arthur and Max leave, he muttered coldly, finally some peace. But peace was far from what Sarah felt in her heart. The no dogs allowed sign hung like a blemish in a space once filled with warmth and kindness. Mike Harris sat in his patrol car, its engine silent but its presence unmistakable, parked at the corner of the street. The car's headlights were off, yet the glow from the dashboard cast enough light to highlight his cold, rigid expression. His gaze was fixed on Arthur's modest home, a small house with weathered wooden fencing and a carefully tended garden. To Mike, the simple peace Arthur enjoyed and the unwavering loyalty of his dog Max seemed to ignite an inexplicable rage within him. The lights in Arthur's home remained on. Mike could see the old man through the window, sitting calmly at a wooden table with one hand resting on Max's head. Every movement Arthur made seemed deliberate, exuding a calm defiance that only served to enrage Mike. Further, he knew Arthur was aware of his presence, and it was that silent awareness, without fear or confrontation, that angered him most. Don't think I don't see you, Mike muttered. His sharp eyes locked onto the window. Max suddenly lifted his head, ears pricking up as the dog stared directly at the patrol car. A low growl rumbled in Max's throat, cautious yet assertive, a clear warning. Mike squinted and let a smirk play across his lips. Good dog, he murmured, his tone dripping with mockery. You know I'm here. Mike's behavior grew more brazen. His patrol car began appearing at random times, even in the dead of night, adding to Arthur's growing sense of helplessness and frustration. Max became increasingly alert every time the patrol car appeared. The dog barked loudly, standing guard at the door, his watchful eyes never straying from the direction of the vehicle. Arthur noticed the rising tension in Max, mirroring the strain he felt himself, but he couldn't find a way to stop the relentless harassment. Meanwhile, glimpses into Mike Harris's personal life offered a deeper understanding of the man he had become. That evening, after leaving Arthur's neighborhood, Mike returned home, a run-down house where his father William Harris sat in his usual armchair. William was an older man still carrying an air of authority with piercing eyes and a gruff voice. In his hand he held a wooden cane, not just a support for his age, but a silent symbol of unyielding control. Out causing trouble again, huh? William's voice, raspy yet commanding, filled the room. Mike dropped into a chair, unbuckled his gun belt, and let it fall onto the table with a soft thud. "Not your business, Dad," he replied, his tone strained but controlled. William tapped the floor with his cane, the dry sound cutting through the stillness. "As a cop, you don't let anyone get the better of you. What did I teach you? Control is everything. If you let some old man and his dog challenge you, then you're worth nothing." Mike said nothing, his gaze unfocused, as if lost in a fog. He had heard these words 1,000 times growing up, standing before the towering figure of his father. Now, as a grown man, they still clung to him, pulling him back to the helpless, angry boy he once was. "That old man doesn't belong here," William continued, his voice sharp. "You make sure he knows that. There are rules in this place, and don't let me hear about you losing face." Mike remained silent, his inner rage smoldering like embers stoked by every word William spoke. He left the room, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Deep down, he knew his hostility toward Arthur was not just about prejudice, it was rooted in the suffocating expectations of a father who demanded perfection and absolute control. In the days that followed, the tension in the neighborhood escalated. Mike's patrol car appeared even more frequently, often parked outside Arthur's home at odd hours. Sometimes he did nothing, merely sitting in the car, his piercing gaze seemingly boring through the walls of Arthur's house. But that silence spoke volumes, filling the air with an undeniable sense of menace. One night, under the faint glow of moonlight, the sound of the patrol car's engine broke the quiet outside Arthur's home. Max barked furiously, leaping to the window to shield his owner from the unseen threat. Arthur rose from his chair, pulled back the curtain, and peered outside. In the dim light, he could see Mike sitting in his car, his cold eyes fixed on the house like a predator stalking its prey. Arthur gripped the cane by the door, a mix of fear and anger rising within him. Max was no longer the gentle dog he once was. He stayed on high alert, reacting to every unfamiliar sound with intense vigilance. Each night, as Arthur prepared for bed, Max positioned himself by the door, his eyes scanning the darkness outside with unwavering focus. Arthur knew this couldn't go on, but he also understood that confronting Mike Harris, a man wielding not just authority but deeply personal animosity, would not be an easy battle to fight. Morning sunlight filtered through the trees, illuminating the path where Arthur usually walked Max. Today, he decided to stop by the supermarket to pick up a bag of dog food for Max and a few essentials for himself. Max, with his gently wagging tail, walked faithfully at Arthur's side as always, his wide, alert eyes radiating loyalty and calm vigilance. The supermarket was quiet, and Arthur relished the rare peaceful moment with Max. But across the aisles, Mike Harris appeared, his cold gaze locking onto them immediately. A sly smirk curled on his lips, a harbinger of trouble. Mike stopped a few steps away from Arthur, the air between them heavy with tension. A few onlookers turned to observe, sensing the thick animosity in the atmosphere. Arthur, though he tried to stay calm, realized his hand was gripping the shopping cart handle so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Max stood protectively in front of him, a low growl emanating from his throat, ears pricked in alertness. "Arthur," Mike said, his voice low but sharp like a knife, "that dog doesn't belong here." "Max isn't bothering anyone," Arthur replied, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable firmness. Mike's smirk deepened, though his eyes betrayed a simmering hatred. "So you're daring me to act then? Buying food for that mutt?" Mike sneered, stepping closer. "Spending money on something that worthless, what a waste." Arthur didn't reply. He placed the bag of Max's food in the cart, determined not to let Mike get under his skin. But Max, sensing the hostility, began to growl softly, his ears rigid with warning. Mike glanced down at Max, his disdain evident. "Teach it to shut up," Mike barked, his voice full of arrogance. When Arthur remained silent, Mike leaned in closer, his tone turning colder. "Or is it that you can't control it?" The words were like kindling to a fire, but Arthur maintained his composure. Max hasn't done anything wrong. Leave us alone. Mike let out a short, derisive laugh. Leave you alone? I don't think so. Without warning, Mike lashed out, kicking Max hard in the side. The vicious blow sent the dog yelping in pain as he tumbled to the floor. The sound of Max's cry hit Arthur like a blade to the heart. He immediately knelt beside his dog, his trembling hands checking for injuries, his eyes burning with a mix of fury and anguish. Arthur looked up, meeting Mike's gaze. This time, the usual silence that defined Arthur's responses was gone, replaced by a storm of rage. "What did you just do?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the quiet supermarket. Mike shrugged nonchalantly, feigning innocence. "The dog was in my way. I was just defending myself." Those words poured gasoline on the fire. No longer able to restrain himself, Arthur shot to his feet, his fist clenched tightly. "You bastard!" he yelled before swinging a punch that landed squarely on Mike's face. The force of the blow caused Mike to stumble, but it also set off a chain reaction. Mike lunged at Arthur, and the two men grappled in the middle of the supermarket aisle. Fists flew, and angry shouts echoed, drawing the attention of stunned shoppers. Some screamed while others froze in place, unsure of what to do. Someone called the police, and within minutes, sirens blared outside. Police officers stormed in and separated the two men. Both were left panting, their clothes disheveled and their faces bruised. But Mike, with a split lip and a smear of blood on his cheek, managed to keep a smug grin. "This old man attacked me for no reason," he said, his voice dripping with mock indignation. I was just standing here." Arthur struggled against the officers restraining him, pointing desperately at Max, who was still whimpering on the floor. "He kicked Max. He started it." But Arthur's words went unheard. His hands were cuffed, and he was led away as onlookers watched in shock and dismay. Mike stood still, wiping the blood from his lip, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Did you think you could win?" he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for himself to hear. "You lost the moment this started." As the police car drove off with Arthur inside, its sirens fading into the distance, Max's plaintive whimpers lingered in the air. For Arthur, those cries would echo in his mind, a painful reminder of the injustice he had just endured. Arthur Brown sat silently on the cold bench in the holding cell, the echoes of the supermarket altercation still ringing in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Max's whimpers, saw Mike Harris's cold gaze, and felt the helplessness of the steel cuffs locking his hands. But deep within him, a fire burned steadily, not one of explosive anger but of determination to reclaim justice. The first day of the trial arrived faster than Arthur anticipated. As he entered the courtroom, his eyes immediately locked on Mike, seated confidently at the plaintiff's table. Mike looked composed, even smug, a small bandage on the corner of his mouth serving as a visible reminder of the attack he alleged. Sitting upright, his cold, calculating eyes followed Arthur, a silent reminder of who still held the upper hand. The trial began with Mike's testimony. Taking the witness stand, he exuded confidence, his tone measured and emotive, presenting himself as a victim. "Your Honor," Mike began, his voice calibrated to convey both distress and resolve, "I was simply shopping like any other citizen when Arthur Brown attacked me. His dog, a dangerous animal, growled and threatened me. I had no choice but to defend myself. Unfortunately, Mr. Brown reacted violently, injuring me and endangering the safety of everyone around us." Mike's testimony was delivered smoothly, almost flawlessly. He painted a picture of himself as a dedicated police officer caught in an unfortunate situation where he had to act. With every word, he pushed Arthur further into the role of an unhinged aggressor. Arthur sat silently, his hands clenched beneath the table. Each word from Mike felt like a dagger slicing at his dignity. But he knew that showing anger would only make him look worse in the eyes of the jury. Arthur could feel the weight of the room's gaze on him. Some eyes held skepticism, others curiosity, but few carried sympathy. He wanted to stand up, to shout the truth, to call Mike a liar. But Arthur understood that anger would not help him. Instead, he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and worked to suppress the storm of emotions swirling inside. Among the spectators at the back of the courtroom sat a young face, observing every detail. Ethan Jones, a rookie cop and one of Mike's colleagues, had once admired Mike, seeing him as a model of toughness and decisiveness in the field. But, over the past months, Ethan had begun noticing another side to his senior colleague, a coldness and a pattern of subtle abuses of power. As Mike testified, Ethan felt a gnawing unease. Mike's words sounded plausible, but they didn't align with what Ethan knew of him, a man who harbored a clear animosity toward Arthur and Max, and who often went out of his way to intimidate those he disliked. Ethan had also heard rumors about Mike frequently patrolling near Arthur's home, a pattern that seemed far from coincidental. Ethan wanted to speak up, to say something, but fear held him back. As a new officer, he understood the risks of challenging a seasoned colleague like Mike. Yet a question nagged at him relentlessly: can I remain silent without betraying my conscience? When it was Arthur's turn to testify, he approached the stand slowly but with deliberate resolve. He recounted the incident from his perspective, his voice steady and tinged with pain. He didn't embellish or dramatize, he simply told the truth. I did not attack him, Arthur said, his eyes locking firmly with the judge. He attacked Max, my dog. He kicked him for no reason. I reacted as anyone would when someone they love is hurt. Arthur's words, though heartfelt, struggled to compete with the polished narrative Mike had delivered. But his unwavering gaze and quiet dignity spoke volumes. Arthur knew the truth was on his side, and that gave him strength. Ethan left the courtroom at the end of the first day with his mind in turmoil. He stood in the hallway, looking through the large glass window at Mike, who was talking with his lawyer. The smug expression on Mike's face only deepened Ethan's internal conflict. At that moment, Ethan realized that if he didn't speak up, justice might never be served. But could he summon the courage to confront Mike and the very system he had only recently joined? Within Ethan, the battle between his conscience and his fear intensified, signaling that a critical turning point was drawing near. The courtroom was heavy with tension the next morning as the trial resumed. The testimony Mike Harris had given the previous day lingered in the minds of the jury like a thick fog, obscuring the truth. Mike, seated confidently at the plaintiff's table, exuded unshaken self-assurance. A faint smile played on his lips as though he were certain of victory, as though this trial were merely a play in which he had orchestrated every scene. Arthur Brown sat quietly a short distance away, his head bowed in thought. Outwardly, he maintained an air of calm, but inside him raged a storm. He had spoken the truth, yet his words had been overshadowed by Mike's polished performance, a performance carefully designed to seed doubt. Arthur wondered, was justice truly attainable in this room? But no one could have predicted that the truth would soon emerge in a way no one anticipated. The courtroom doors suddenly swung open, and the sound echoed through the chamber, drawing all eyes toward the entrance. A middle-aged man entered, clutching a laptop tightly to his chest. It was Raj Patel, the owner of the supermarket where the incident had occurred. His sharp gaze betrayed urgency as he marched forward and addressed the court in a firm voice. Your Honor, Raj Patel began, his breath slightly labored, I have evidence. The security cameras in my store captured the entire incident. This video will reveal the truth. The room froze. The judge arched an eyebrow, motioning for Patel to approach. A palpable sense of anticipation filled the air as the laptop was connected to the courtroom's large screen. Mike, who had been lounging with ease, suddenly stiffened. His gaze fixed on Patel, his eyes betraying unease. The screen flickered to life, and the video began to play. The footage was clear. Arthur stood calmly at the checkout counter, Max sitting obediently at his side. There was no sign of aggression. Then, from a distance, Mike appeared, his cold eyes locked on Arthur as he approached. Max remained motionless, showing no provocation. Without warning, Mike raised his foot and delivered a vicious kick to the dog. The sound of Max's pained yelp echoed from the speakers, causing some in the audience to turn away, unable to bear the sight. A woman on the jury covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with horror. In the corner of the room, Sarah, the diner owner, sat frozen, her eyes welling with tears as disbelief etched itself onto her face. The courtroom fell silent as Max's anguished cries played on, cutting deep into the hearts of everyone present. The video showed Arthur kneeling beside his dog, his face a mask of pain and helplessness. Then came Arthur's outburst of anger, the punch he delivered in fury, and finally the intervention of the supermarket security staff. A wave of murmurs swept through the room, rippling outward like waves. Some people shook their heads. Others sighed audibly, their eyes now fixed on Mike with unmistakable anger. The jury, previously hesitant, now wore expressions of shock and disapproval. Mike leapt to his feet, his veneer of confidence crumbling in an instant. "Wait," he shouted, his voice trembling. I thought the dog was going to attack me. I was just protecting myself and everyone around us." But his frantic, stumbling defense held no weight anymore. The video had spoken the truth. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward Mike, no longer seeing a victim but a man exposed as a cruel manipulator who had tried to conceal his malice with lies. Arthur's lawyer seized the moment, rising to her feet with a determined voice. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "this video is indisputable evidence. It proves that my client, Mr. Arthur Brown, did not initiate violence but was, in fact, the victim of an unprovoked and malicious act. Furthermore, it exposes the serious abuse of power by Mike Harris, who has attempted to distort the truth to hide his wrongdoing." Mike turned, his eyes darting desperately around the room, searching for an ally. But there was none. Even Ethan Jones, his young colleague seated at the back, avoided his gaze. At that moment, Mike realized he had nothing left, no power, no support. He was utterly exposed. The judge leaned forward, his voice resounding with authority. "Mr. Harris, this video reveals the truth you sought to conceal. Your actions were not only irresponsible but also cruel. You caused harm to an innocent dog and unjustly tarnished the reputation and rights of Mr. Arthur Brown. Such behavior cannot be tolerated." Mike slumped back into his seat, his entire demeanor drained of strength. In that moment, everything, his authority, his pride, his sense of control, crumbled. He was now merely a man laid bare, stripped of his pretenses under the unforgiving light of truth. Arthur, for the first time since the ordeal began, felt a glimmer of hope. The truth had finally been revealed. Yet he knew the fight was not over. There were still battles ahead, but for the first time, he realized he was no longer fighting alone. The courtroom fell silent after the judge's stern conclusion. Mike Harris sat motionless, his shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of the world. He stared at the table in front of him, his reflection no longer that of a figure of authority but a man marred by disgrace and failure. Before the judge could deliver the final verdict, a knock echoed from the back of the courtroom. All heads turned to see a middle-aged man in a long coat and hat, his face partially obscured. He walked toward the judge with a slight tremor in his step, placing a folder on the desk. "I am a new witness with additional evidence regarding Mr. Mike Harris," the man said, his voice hoarse but steady. The judge raised an eyebrow, motioning for him to continue. The man removed his hat, revealing a gaunt face marked by a faint scar stretching from his temple to his chin. "My name is Jonathan Carter. I used to work in this town but was forced to leave due to threats from Mike Harris himself," he began. "I can no longer stay silent knowing he has done the same to Arthur Brown." Jonathan recounted in painstaking detail how Mike had once coerced him into falsifying evidence in an older case. When he refused, Mike used his influence to tarnish Jonathan's reputation, forcing him to leave town under a cloud of false accusations. "I kept the threatening letters he sent me," Jonathan said, pulling a bundle of old, worn papers from his coat and handing them to the judge. "If I don't speak now, I will never forgive myself." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Jonathan's testimony painted a clearer picture of Mike's systematic abuse of power. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern. Mike, who had maintained a facade of confidence, now hung his head in defeat. The judge's expression darkened as he examined the letters, his lips pressed tightly together as though restraining his anger. A sharp rap of the judge's gavel broke the silence, resonating through the courtroom like a nail driven into the coffin of Mike Harris's career. "Mr. Harris, I hereby order your immediate termination from the police force. Furthermore, you are charged with abuse of power, assault, and harassment. This case will be referred to higher authorities for criminal proceedings." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Jury members, lawyers, and spectators alike felt the weight of the judge's ruling. It wasn't just a punishment for Mike Harris, but a powerful statement that abuse of power, no matter who commits it, will not go unpunished. In the back row, Ethan Jones felt his chest tighten. For too long, he had stayed silent, unwilling to challenge Mike even when he knew his actions were wrong. But now, seeing Arthur lift his head with quiet resolve and Mike slumped in defeat, Ethan realized he could no longer stand on the sidelines. Ethan rose, his steps deliberate as he moved to the front of the courtroom. The room turned to watch him, curious about what he had to say. His voice quivered slightly but carried an unmistakable determination. "Your Honor, I have something to add." The judge looked at him, surprised but encouraging. "Go ahead." "As a colleague of Mike Harris, I've witnessed several instances of his misconduct," Ethan began. "I remained silent out of fear for my career, but now I see that my silence only enabled his behavior to continue." He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Mike Harris has abused his power on numerous occasions. He frequently harassed and intimidated Mr. Arthur Brown. I can testify that he would often park near Mr. Brown's house, staring him down and creating a hostile environment. He also pressured Sarah's diner into banning Mr. Brown and his dog Max. These actions were not those of a protector but of a bully." Ethan's words left the courtroom in stunned silence. Even Mike, who had tried to maintain composure, could not hide his mix of anger and fear. He turned to glare at Ethan, but the younger officer didn't flinch. The judge nodded, his face reflecting approval for Ethan's courage. "Thank you, Mr. Jones. Your testimony will be added to the case file and will aid in further uncovering the extent of Mr. Harris's misconduct." Ethan returned to his seat, his heart pounding, but a profound sense of relief washed over him. He knew he had finally done the right thing. As the trial concluded, Arthur Brown exited the courtroom to an outpouring of support from those present. Some patted his shoulder, offering smiles of encouragement, while others paused to express their sympathy. Yet what mattered most to Arthur was the meaningful nod from Ethan. Without words, Arthur placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, a silent gesture of gratitude. Mike Harris, on the other hand, left the courtroom under police escort. His face, once marked with arrogance, now bore only bitterness and despair. Outside the courthouse, a group of reporters and townsfolk waited, their expressions ranging from contempt to outright anger. A middle-aged man, once a classmate of Mike's, shouted, "You've disgraced this entire town." The murmurs swelled into an audible wave of condemnation. "Abuser of power," a woman yelled, her voice trembling with indignation. Some turned their backs on him, a visible act of rejection. Mike kept his head down, trying to move quickly past the crowd, but the isolation closed in around him with every step. Even his former colleagues, who had once defended Mike, now avoided meeting his gaze. A young officer whispered to another, "He doesn't deserve to wear that badge." As Mike climbed into the police car, his final view was of the crowd's turned backs and unyielding faces. For the first time, he truly felt the depth of his loss, not just his career, but his place in the community. Yet even in defeat, Mike struggled to accept the truth. Before the car pulled away, he cast one last hateful glance at Arthur. Arthur did not look away. His gaze met Mike's, unflinching, as if to say, "I'm not afraid of you, and I will never bow to injustice again." When the car disappeared, Arthur turned to Max, waiting patiently outside the courthouse. Max wagged his tail gently, his eyes full of trust and affection. Arthur knelt to pet him, his hands steady and firm. For the first time in a long while, Arthur felt a deep sense of vindication. He had stood his ground and protected what mattered most, the truth, loyalty, and belief in justice. As time passed, the town gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but for Mike Harris, life would never be the same. After his sentencing, Mike faced the cold rejection of the community. Those who once called him a friend now avoided him, and former colleagues wouldn't even acknowledge him when they crossed paths on the street. Mike realized that his abuse of power had not only harmed Arthur but had also cost him the trust and respect of those around him. In the early days of his time at the rehabilitation center, Mike kept to himself, weighed down by a heavy sense of shame. But one day, he received a letter. The sender was Arthur Brown. "Mike," the letter began, "I'm not writing this to accuse or blame you. I'm writing because I believe everyone deserves a second chance. Your mistakes have caused harm to many, but that doesn't mean you can't change and make amends. If you're willing, I hope you can use your experiences to help others avoid the same path. The words in the letter stirred something deep within Mike, a sense of guilt he hadn't allowed himself to confront in a long time. He began participating in the programs at the center, not just to reform himself but to share his story, warning others of the dangers of abusing power. After completing his rehabilitation, Mike volunteered at a local organization helping former offenders reintegrate into society. He also organized talks on ethical responsibility, hoping to turn his past into a lesson for others. One afternoon, Mike decided to visit Arthur. He stood before the white gate of the small house, hesitant but resolute. Max, recognizing him, let out a low growl but did not appear hostile. A moment later, Arthur stepped outside, his gaze steady and calm, devoid of the animosity it once held. Mike bowed his head, his voice rough with emotion. "I came to apologize," he said, "not just for what I did to you and Max, but also for what I did to myself. Thank you for giving me a chance to reflect." Arthur studied him for a long moment, then opened the gate and gestured for him to come in. "Redemption begins with acknowledging your mistakes," he said softly. Max, sensing the reconciliation taking place, approached Mike and wagged his tail gently, as if offering an unspoken truce. Arthur Brown stood outside Sarah's diner on a crisp morning, Max by his side. Walking more steadily now after weeks of recovery, the faint scar on Max's side was a lingering reminder of what they had endured together. As Arthur placed his hand on the familiar door handle, memories of the last time he stood there flooded back, the "no dogs allowed" sign glaring coldly from the window, the averted gazes of those inside, and the deep sense of isolation as he turned and walked away. But today, everything was different. Inside the diner, time seemed to pause as the door swung open. Whispered conversations ceased, and all eyes turned to Arthur and Max. This time, there was no avoidance or cold silence. Instead, the entire diner rose to their feet, and a round of applause erupted, filling the space with warmth and appreciation. Max, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, wagged his tail. His bright eyes looked up at Arthur, who bent down to pat Max's head gently before stepping inside. Each step was heavy with emotion but also brimming with pride. Sarah, the diner's owner, emerged from behind the counter, her face etched with remorse but also relief. "Arthur," she began, her voice catching in her throat, "thank you for coming back. We were wrong, and I want to personally apologize. This diner has always been for everyone, and I let fear make me forget that." Arthur regarded Sarah for a moment before nodding gently. "It's all right, Sarah," he said, his deep voice steady yet tinged with emotion. "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we choose to make things right." A table had been prepared for Arthur and Max by the window, where they used to sit. On it was a small bouquet and a plate filled with Max's favorite bacon strips. Max trotted over eagerly, his still recovering leg slightly unsteady but his excitement undeniable. He quickly settled down to enjoy his meal, drawing cheers and laughter from the patrons around him. The support for Arthur and Max didn't stop at the diner. One morning, Arthur awoke to find a group of young neighbors repainting the wooden fence around his house. The old, weathered boards were being replaced and painted bright white, giving the house a renewed vitality. A young woman approached him with a large basket filled with baked goods and treats for Max. "We owe you so much, Mr. Brown," she said, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We stayed silent for too long. It's time to do the right thing." Arthur smiled softly, saying nothing. He didn't expect the acts of reparation, but he could see the sincerity in their gestures, and that was enough to ease the weight on his heart. As Max continued his recovery, he became a beloved figure in the neighborhood. Children would rush out with toys and treats whenever Arthur walked him. They laughed as Max wagged his tail and played with them, his cheerful demeanor winning over everyone. One small boy handed Arthur a drawing he had made, a picture of Arthur and Max standing under a shining sun, both smiling. "This is you and Max, our heroes," the boy said, his eyes gleaming with admiration. Arthur studied the drawing, his heart swelling with a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice catching in his throat. The story of Arthur and Max began to spread far beyond their small town. A local newspaper featured an article about the trial and Arthur's journey, and it resonated deeply with readers. Letters poured into Arthur's home from across the country, expressing admiration and solidarity. An animal welfare organization even sent Max a special certificate honoring him as a symbol of loyalty and resilience. But the story's reach didn't end there. A major national publication picked up the article, and soon it spread across various media platforms, from television to social media. Headlines such as "The Loyal Dog in the Fight for Justice" and "Abuse of Power Exposed Through the Bond Between Man and Dog" were everywhere, turning Arthur and Max's journey into a national conversation. Arthur and Max were invited to a live television interview. During the program, Arthur shared, "I don't think I did anything extraordinary. I just stood up for what I loved and what I believed was right. But this isn't just my story, it's about justice and the faith we need to uphold in our society." The interview went viral, amassing millions of views. It sparked lively discussions on online forums and social media about police accountability, animal rights, and the power of community solidarity. Inspired by Arthur and Max, several advocacy groups launched campaigns to raise awareness about civil rights and reforming the justice system. The national attention led to tangible change. State officials announced a review of policies governing police oversight and increased training programs on professional ethics. Activists organized workshops using Arthur's story as a powerful example of resilience and courage in the face of injustice. Although humbled by the widespread impact of his story, Arthur remained modest. "I never expected this," he said in another interview. "But if my story inspires someone else to stand up for justice, then that's enough." One sunny morning at Sarah's diner, Arthur sat at his usual table by the window, sunlight streaming warmly onto the checkered tablecloth. Max lay contentedly at his feet, his eyes half closed in post-breakfast satisfaction. The atmosphere in the diner had transformed. Now filled with laughter and camaraderie, customers no longer avoided Arthur. They greeted him warmly, some even sitting to chat. Arthur took a sip of his coffee, his eyes gazing out the window at the lush green park in the distance. His journey with Max had been anything but easy, yet it had brought him more than he could have imagined. It wasn't just about justice, it was about awakening a community and proving that loyalty and truth would always find a way to prevail. In time, the diner became more than a symbol of reconciliation, it became a hub for the community. Sarah decided to host monthly events, bringing people together to celebrate stories of resilience and kindness. Posters honoring Max, titled "The Most Loyal Friend," were displayed prominently, serving as a reminder of the dog who had captured everyone's hearts. Sarah also started a charity fund in Max's name, aimed at supporting animal welfare and helping elderly pet owners cover veterinary costs. Donations poured in from near and far, and the fund quickly gained momentum. One afternoon, Sarah approached Arthur as he finished his coffee. "Arthur," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth, "I hope you know how much you and Max have given us. This diner is what it was always meant to be because of you, a place for everyone." Arthur smiled, his gaze steady. "We all played a part, Sarah. It's about choosing to do what's right, even when it's hard." Outside the diner, life blossomed. The park near Arthur's home, once quiet and neglected, became a gathering place for families, children, and their dogs. A group of young volunteers even built a small memorial in the corner of the park, a wooden plaque engraved with the words, * in honor of Max, a symbol of loyalty, courage, and hope. *. Children would play there, laughing as they tossed balls for their dogs. Occasionally, someone would stop to read the plaque, and their expressions would soften, a silent acknowledgement of the story that had touched their lives. For Arthur, those small moments were the greatest victories. He didn't need grand gestures or accolades. Seeing the community unite, children running alongside their dogs, and people standing up for one another was enough. It was proof that one act of courage could ripple outward and inspire change. Months later, on an autumn afternoon, Arthur stood in the park, watching the vibrant leaves drift gently to the ground. Max sat beside him, his tail wagging contentedly. The faint scar on his side remained, but it had healed well, a reminder not of pain but of endurance. "Come on, Max," Arthur said softly, patting the dog's head. Together, they began walking down the familiar path toward home. As they walked, neighbors waved and called out greetings. A small group of children ran up to pet Max, their laughter ringing through the air. "Look, Mom, it's Max," one little girl shouted, her face beaming with excitement. Arthur paused, allowing the children to pet Max. The dog, patient and gentle as always, wagged his tail happily, soaking in the affection. One boy handed Arthur a drawing he had made. It showed Max surrounded by people, all smiling brightly. At the bottom, the boy had written, "Thank you, Max, for showing us what it means to be brave." Arthur looked at the drawing, his heart swelling with gratitude. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thank you," he said softly. "That means more than you know." As Arthur and Max continued their walk, Arthur couldn't help but smile. The town that had once turned its back on him had transformed. It wasn't perfect, there was still work to be done, but it was better. People were kinder, more aware of one another's struggles, and willing to stand up for what was right. At home, Arthur sat on his porch, Max resting at his feet. The late afternoon sun bathed the small house in golden light. Arthur gazed out at the street, where families strolled together and laughter echoed faintly in the distance. He reached down to scratch behind Max's ears. "We did all right, didn't we, boy?" Max looked up at him, his bright eyes full of trust and understanding, as if to say, "Yes, we did." The bond between Arthur and Max was unshakable. Through pain, injustice, and uncertainty, they had stood together, proving that loyalty and love could overcome even the darkest storms. Their story had inspired change, not just in their town, but far beyond. And for Arthur, that was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Arthur leaned back in his chair, a quiet sense of peace settling over him. Max nuzzled his hand gently, then lay his head on Arthur's foot. Together, they sat in the fading light, content and unbroken, knowing that they had made a difference. In the weeks that followed, life in the town continued to change for the better. Sarah's Diner, once a place of tension and whispered conversations, had become the heart of the community. New customers came in regularly, some drawn by the story of Arthur and Max, others by a desire to experience the warmth and unity the diner now symbolized. Sarah kept a special corner dedicated to Arthur and Max. On the wall hung framed photos of Max, one of him wagging his tail joyfully in the park, another of him sitting faithfully at Arthur's side. Below the photos was a simple plaque, "Loyalty knows no bounds." It had become a spot where customers would pause, reflect, and sometimes leave handwritten notes of gratitude and inspiration. One day, as Arthur sat at his usual table, sipping coffee and scratching behind Max's ears, Sarah approached with a notebook in her hands. "Arthur, I've been getting letters and notes from people who've read your story or seen it on the news. They say it's changed how they think about justice, kindness, and loyalty. I started collecting them here." She handed him the notebook, its pages filled with heartfelt messages from strangers. Arthur flipped through it, his eyes lingering on one letter written in careful handwriting, "Thank you, Mr. Brown and Max, for showing us that standing up for what's right isn't about fighting. It's about refusing to give up. You've made me believe in people again." Arthur looked up, his eyes shimmering with quiet emotion. "Thank you, Sarah," he said simply. "It means a lot to know this has helped someone." Across the town, echoes of Arthur and Max's story continued to inspire others. Teachers in local schools shared the story as an example of courage and integrity, encouraging students to stand up for others and treat everyone with respect. Local businesses began supporting animal welfare programs, sponsoring adoption drives, and raising funds for shelters. The park, once overlooked, was now a lively space filled with laughter and joy. Families brought their dogs to play, and children ran around Max's Corner, the special dog-friendly area named in honor of Arthur's loyal companion. On weekends, volunteers organized events to maintain the park and ensure it remained a safe and welcoming place for everyone. One Saturday morning, Arthur received an unexpected visit. A young woman stood on his porch, holding a small puppy in her arms. "Mr. Brown," she began nervously, "I run the local animal shelter, and we've been overwhelmed with people wanting to adopt pets because of your story. This little guy was found abandoned, but he's strong and full of life, just like Max. I thought, maybe you'd want to meet him." Arthur glanced at Max, who wagged his tail as if giving his approval. Arthur smiled warmly. "Bring him here." The woman handed the puppy to Arthur, and the little dog squirmed excitedly in his arms, licking his chin. Max leaned in curiously, giving the pup a gentle sniff before sitting back with a satisfied huff, as though welcoming the new addition. "I think he'll fit right in," Arthur said with a chuckle, his voice soft but full of affection. The woman beamed. "Thank you, Mr. Brown. You and Max have given so many people hope. This is just one small way we can give back." As the days turned into months, Arthur and Max continued to be a fixture in the town. Wherever they went, people greeted them with smiles and waves. Arthur no longer walked with the weight of isolation and judgment on his shoulders. Instead, he walked with quiet pride, knowing that his actions had not only brought justice but had also inspired a community to change for the better. One evening, the town held a special event in the park. Lanterns lined the pathways, casting a warm, golden glow across the grass. Families gathered with picnic blankets, children played games, and dogs ran freely, their joyful barks echoing through the crisp night air. At the center of it all stood a newly unveiled statue, a life-sized bronze sculpture of Max sitting proudly beside a figure of Arthur, one hand resting gently on the dog's head. The plaque at the base of the statue read, * in honor of loyalty, courage, and the unwavering bond between a man and his dog. A reminder that justice begins with the brave. *. As the crowd gathered around the statue, the mayor stepped forward to address the town. "Arthur Brown and Max have shown us what it means to stand up against injustice, no matter how insurmountable it may seem. Their story has reminded us that change begins with simple acts of courage and kindness. Tonight, we celebrate not just Arthur and Max, but the community we've become because of them." The crowd erupted into applause, and Arthur, standing near the front, felt a deep sense of humility and gratitude. Max, sitting faithfully by his side, looked up at him with trusting eyes, his tail wagging steadily. A young boy approached Arthur, holding a lantern in his hands. "Mr. Brown, can I give this to Max?" Arthur nodded, and the boy placed the lantern gently at the base of the statue. "You're our hero, Max," he whispered before running back to his family. Arthur knelt beside Max, stroking his fur as the lanterns flickered around them. The statue, bathed in soft light, stood as a lasting tribute to the bond that had brought a town together and sparked change far beyond its borders. As the night wore on, Arthur sat on a bench, watching families laugh, play, and share stories. The park had become a place of joy, connection, and unity, a testament to the journey he and Max had endured. Arthur looked down at Max, who rested his head on Arthur's knee. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Max looked up at him, his bright eyes full of understanding, as if to say, "Yes, and we're still here." In that moment, Arthur felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The scars of the past would never fully fade, but they had become reminders of endurance, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. The park quieted as the lanterns continued to glow, illuminating the path home. Arthur rose, his movements slow but steady, and whistled softly for Max. Together, they walked toward the house, the faint sounds of laughter still echoing behind them. At the gate, Arthur paused and turned back to look at the park one last time. The statue stood tall, surrounded by families and dogs playing freely, a living testament to the change they had inspired. Arthur smiled, his heart full. "Come on, Max. Let's go home." As the two disappeared into the night, the lanterns in the park glowed brighter, carrying with them the enduring legacy of loyalty, courage, and hope, a story that would be told for generations to come. Months passed, and the story of Arthur and Max remained alive in the hearts of the townspeople. The quiet bond they shared continued to inspire, not just in the town but across the country, where news of their journey had left a lasting impact. Arthur and Max became symbols of resilience, proof that love, loyalty, and courage could overcome even the most daunting injustices. One cold morning, Arthur awoke to the sound of gentle tapping on his front door. Max, always alert, barked softly before following Arthur as he shuffled to answer it. Standing on the doorstep was Ethan Jones, the young police officer who had spoken up during Mike Harris's trial. Arthur raised an eyebrow, surprised to see him. "Morning, Ethan. Everything all right?" Ethan shifted nervously, holding a small envelope in his hand. "Good morning, Mr. Brown. I just wanted to stop by and give you this." He extended the envelope toward Arthur, his voice tinged with hesitation. "It's something I felt you should have." Arthur accepted the envelope and gestured for Ethan to join him on the porch. "Take a seat, son." You look like you've got a lot on your mind. Ethan sat down, exhaling deeply. I'd been thinking about everything that happened. What Mike did, what I let happen by staying silent for so long. He paused, his gaze fixed on his hands. I spent a lot of time ashamed of myself, Mr. Brown. I wanted to tell you that I'm truly sorry. Arthur studied the young man for a moment, his expression thoughtful. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, he said finally, his voice steady. Speaking up in that courtroom couldn't have been easy. You did the right thing when it mattered most, and that's what counts. Ethan looked up, his eyes brimming with relief. Thank you for saying that. I've been trying to learn from it how to be better, how to make things right. That's why I'm here. Arthur opened the envelope, revealing a small, handwritten note alongside a certificate. Ethan explained quietly, after everything, the department started a new initiative to train officers on ethical responsibility and community trust. It's being called the Brown and Max Initiative. It's named after you and Max, to remind every officer of the importance of integrity and compassion. Arthur blinked, momentarily speechless as he read the note. The certificate, simple yet meaningful, honored Arthur and Max for their enduring impact on justice, loyalty, and community trust. I don't know what to say, Arthur murmured, his voice low but full of emotion. Ethan smiled faintly. You don't need to say anything. You already taught us more than you'll ever know. Arthur glanced at Max, who sat patiently by his feet, his tail thumping softly against the wooden porch. I guess we did all right, didn't we, boy? Max looked up at him, his expression as steady and loyal as ever, and Arthur chuckled softly. Ethan stood, ready to leave, but before he turned, he said, You're a good man, Mr. Brown. And Max, he's one of a kind. Thank you for reminding us all what really matters. Arthur watched him leave, his heart full of quiet pride. He looked back at the certificate and smiled, placing it carefully on the small table beside him. For a long time, he sat there, watching the town slowly come to life under the morning sun, Max curled up contentedly at his feet. That afternoon, Arthur took Max for a walk to the park. The air was crisp, the leaves a kaleidoscope of golds and reds, and the laughter of children echoed through the trees. Max trotted happily at Arthur's side, his gait steady despite the scar that marked his side. As they approached Max's corner, Arthur noticed a group of children gathered around a small chalkboard sign. They were drawing pictures of their dogs and leaving messages for Max, simple notes of love, gratitude, and admiration. One little girl noticed Arthur and ran up to him, holding a crumpled paper. Mr. Brown, look. I drew Max, she said, holding up the drawing proudly. It showed a large, smiling Max surrounded by flowers, with the words Max the Brave written in bright, colorful letters. Arthur knelt down, his voice soft. That's beautiful. Max is going to love it. The little girl beamed and ran back to her friends, who waved excitedly at Arthur. He waved back, then glanced at Max. Looks like your famous partner. Max wagged his tail, his bright eyes scanning the park where families played, dogs ran freely, and laughter filled the air. Arthur stood for a long moment, taking it all in, the beauty of the park, the joy of the children, and the warmth of a community that had come together, stronger than before. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Arthur sat on his porch with Max at his side. The day had been long but full of moments that reminded him how far they had come. The faint scar on Max's side would always be there, a mark of a painful past, but it no longer defined them. Arthur reached down to scratch behind Max's ears, his voice calm and steady. We made it, boy. We're still standing. Max looked up at him, his tail wagging gently, as if to say, we always will.